The sharp crack of splintering wood echoed through the abandoned mine shaft as Molly Calloway realized, with horrifying clarity, that she was going to die. The year was 1878, and what had started as a simple expedition to document the forgotten silver mines of Val Verde, Texas, for her newspaper column had turned into a desperate fight for survival as the ancient support beams gave way above her. "Help!" she screamed, her voice swallowed by the earth as tons of weathered timber collapsed. A massive wooden beam pinned her to the ground, crushing her legs and trapping her in the suffocating darkness. Dust filled her lungs and panic clawed at her throat. No one knew she was here. No one would find her. Then came the footsteps. "Hello, is somebody down there?" A deep voice called out, accompanied by the bobbing light of a lantern. "Here," Molly cried, coughing through the cloud of dust. "I'm trapped." The light drew closer, illuminating a tall silhouette. As he approached, the lantern revealed a weather-beaten face beneath a wide-brimmed hat's strong jawline, concerned blue eyes, and several days' worth of stubble. He wore dusty trail clothes and worn leather chaps over denim pants, the quintessential cowboy down to his spurred boots. "Good Lord," he muttered, setting the lantern down and kneeling beside her. "What are you doing in here, miss? This mine's been condemned for years." "Reporting," Molly gasped, the weight of the beam making it difficult to breathe. "For the Val Verde Chronicle." He assessed the situation quickly, eyes darting around the unstable tunnel. "Name's Kurt Valentin. I'd tip my hat, but we've got more pressing matters." He positioned himself by the massive beam that pinned her legs, tested its weight, and frowned. "This is going to be difficult, but I need you to be ready to move the instant I lift this." "Can you do that?" Molly nodded, though she wasn't certain her legs would cooperate. She watched as he braced himself, muscles tensing beneath his worn cotton shirt. With a deep breath, Kurt gripped the massive timber and heaved upward. The veins in his neck bulged with exertion, and for a terrifying moment Molly thought the beam wouldn't budge. Then it shifted. Just enough. "Now," Kurt commanded through gritted teeth. Ignoring the screaming pain, Molly dragged herself forward, inch by agonizing inch. The moment she cleared the beam, Kurt released it with a thunderous crash that sent more dust billowing through the shaft. Before she could even attempt to stand, he had swept her into his arms. "The whole place is coming down," he said, already moving toward the entrance. "Hold tight." Molly clutched his shoulders as he navigated the treacherous tunnel, ducking under sagging supports and leaping over fallen debris. The sound of cracking timber followed them like the mine itself was giving chase. Daylight appeared ahead, a small, precious rectangle of blue sky that grew larger with each of Kurt's determined strides. They burst into the open air just as a final, deafening collapse sent a plume of dust shooting from the mine entrance. Kurt didn't stop until they reached a safe distance, finally setting Molly down on a patch of sun-warmed grass. "You're bleeding," he said, nodding toward her legs. Molly looked down to see her skirts torn and stained with dirt and blood. Now that the immediate danger had passed, the pain hit her in earnest. "I think I might be in trouble," she admitted, trying to sound braver than she felt. Kurt knelt beside her, carefully examining her injuries. "Nothing's broken from what I can tell, but these cuts need tending." He glanced at the setting sun. "My camp's not far. We can't make it back to town before dark, but I've got supplies there." "Why were you here?" Molly asked suddenly, suspicion belatedly replacing gratitude. "These mines have been abandoned for years." A smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "I could ask you the same question, Miss Calloway, Molly Calloway, Miss Calloway." He touched the brim of his hat. "I track and capture bounties for the law, was following the trail of the Harker gang. They've been using these old mines to cache stolen goods." His eyes returned to her injuries. "But that'll keep. Right now, we need to get you patched up before infection sets in." Without waiting for her reply, Kurt gathered her into his arms once more and carried her toward his horse, a magnificent chestnut stallion waiting patiently nearby. Molly wanted to protest, to insist she could walk, but the throbbing in her legs told her otherwise. Instead, she found herself studying the strong line of his jaw and the determined set of his mouth as he gently placed her on his saddle, then mounted behind her. As they rode away from the collapsed mine, Molly Calloway had no way of knowing that the man who had just saved her life would soon become the subject of the most important story she would ever write their own. Kurt's camp was nestled in a small grove of cottonwoods near a shallow creek. The setting sun painted the landscape in hues of gold and amber as he carefully helped Molly down from his horse. She winced as her feet touched the ground, but stubbornly refused to cry out. "You're stubborn," Kurt observed, supporting her weight as they moved toward the campfire. "I'm a woman reporter in Texas. Stubborn is a prerequisite," Molly replied through clenched teeth. He laughed, a rich, genuine sound that seemed to warm the air around them. "Fair enough. Here, sit on this." He spread a bedroll near the small fire that was already burning low. "I'll tend to your legs, then see about some food." Molly eased herself down, watching as Kurt retrieved a battered leather satchel from his saddlebags. "Are you a doctor as well as a bounty hunter?" "No, madam, but spend enough time on the trail and you learn to patch yourself up." He knelt beside her and gently rolled up the torn fabric of her skirt to reveal several deep cuts and a rapidly forming bruise that spread like a storm cloud across her calf. "This might sting." From the satchel, he produced a flask of whiskey, a clean cloth, and a small tin of salve. When he poured the whiskey over the first wound, Molly bit her lip to stifle a cry but couldn't prevent a sharp intake of breath. "Sorry," Kurt murmured, his touch surprisingly gentle for hands so weathered and strong. "Infection's a killer out here. Can't take chances." As he worked, cleaning each cut and applying the salve, Molly studied him more carefully. He was older than she'd first thought, perhaps in his early 30s, with fine lines around his eyes that spoke of long days under the harsh Texas sun. His movements were methodical and efficient, suggesting years of self-sufficiency. "How did you know I was in the mine?" she asked. Kurt didn't look up from his work. "Heard the collapse, then your call for help." He tied a clean strip of cloth around her worst cut. "What possessed you to go into that death trap alone?" Molly straightened her back. "I'm writing a series on forgotten landmarks of Val Verde. The Chronicle thought it might help bring some investment to the area if we highlighted our history. So they sent you crawling into condemned mines." His tone made it clear what he thought of that editorial decision. "They didn't send me anywhere," Molly said defensively. "It was my idea, and I didn't go crawling in. I was standing just inside the entrance, taking notes when the supports gave way." Kurt raised an eyebrow but didn't argue. "There," he said, sitting back on his heels. "That should hold for now, but you'll need a proper doctor once we get back to town." "Thank you," Molly said, suddenly very aware of his proximity. "For everything." He nodded once, then stood to retrieve a coffee pot and tin cups from his pack. "Can you stomach coffee and jerky? It's all I have to offer until morning." "That sounds perfect," she replied, though in truth, the thought of food made her stomach turn. The events of the day were catching up with her, and exhaustion pulled at her limbs like quicksand. As Kurt busied himself with the fire and coffee, Molly took the opportunity to observe their surroundings. The camp was sparse but well organized, everything a man would need to survive comfortably on the trail. Nothing more. A worn saddle served as a backrest near the fire. Saddlebags hung from a tree branch, alongside a rifle in its leather scabbard. "How long have you been a bounty hunter?" she asked as he handed her a steaming cup. 8 years, Kurt replied, settling across the fire from her. After the war, there weren't many options for a former cavalry scout with no land and no trade. You fought for the Union. A shadow passed over his face. Yes. The word was clipped final. He clearly had no desire to elaborate. Molly sipped her coffee, letting the bitter warmth chase away some of the day's chill. And the Harker gang, are they dangerous? 3 brothers who have been robbing banks and stage coaches from here to El Paso, Kurt said, relaxing somewhat as the conversation shifted. They're not the worst I've tracked, but they're cunning. Been staying one step ahead for months now. Until they made the mistake of coming to Val Verde, Molly observed. Kurt's mouth quirked in a half-smile. Something like that. He studied her over the rim of his cup. You always ask this many questions, Miss Calloway. It's my job, she replied simply. And please call me Molly. Molly. He tested the name, and something about the way it sounded in his deep voice made her cheeks warm. Well, Molly, you should rest. We've got a long ride to town tomorrow, and those legs won't thank you for pushing them. She wanted to argue, to ask more questions, but the day's events had indeed taken their toll. Even sitting upright was becoming a struggle. Kurt must have noticed, for he stood and came around the fire, arranging his bedroll into a more comfortable position. You take this, he said. I'll keep watch. But where will you sleep? Molly protested. Kurt patted the saddle. I've had worse beds. Before she could object further, he gently helped her lie down, his strong hands supporting her as she eased into a reclining position. Rest now. Too tired to argue, Molly closed her eyes. The last thing she remembered before sleep claimed her was the comforting sound of Kurt moving around the camp, and the feeling that, despite everything, she was safe. When Molly awoke, the first light of dawn was filtering through the cottonwood leaves. For a disorienting moment, she couldn't remember where she was or why her legs throbbed with pain. Then the events of the previous day came flooding back: the mine collapse, the rescue, Kurt Valentin. She pushed herself up on her elbows, wincing as the movement sent fresh waves of pain through her injured legs. Kurt was already awake, crouched by the creek with his back to her. He had removed his shirt, and Molly found herself transfixed by the play of muscles across his back and shoulders as he splashed water on his face and neck. His skin was tanned and marked with several scars, testament to the dangerous life he led. Embarrassed by her staring, Molly cleared her throat. Kurt turned, unsurprised to find her awake. He reached for his shirt and pulled it on before approaching the camp. Morning, he said, his voice still rough with sleep. How are the legs? Sore, Molly admitted, but I'll manage. Kurt nodded and set about reviving the fire. Coffee first, then I'll check those bandages. We should reach Val Verde by midday if we set out soon. While he worked, Molly attempted to smooth her rumpled clothing and pin up her hair, which had mostly escaped its arrangement during the night. She was acutely aware of how disheveled she must look, but Kurt showed no sign of noticing or caring. After a quick breakfast of coffee and the last of the jerky, Kurt knelt beside her to examine her wounds. His expression remained neutral as he removed the bandages, but Molly could see concern in the tightening around his eyes. The cuts are clean, he said finally, but that bruise is spreading. We need to get you to Doc Miller as soon as possible. He helped her to her feet, and Molly was dismayed to discover that her right leg could barely support any weight. Before she could voice her concern, Kurt had swept her into his arms once more. This is becoming a habit, she said, trying to mask her discomfort with humor. One I don't mind, he replied with surprising candor, carrying her effortlessly to his waiting horse. The comment hung in the air between them, neither acknowledging the implication. The ride to Val Verde was slow and careful, with Kurt clearly mindful of Molly's injuries. He kept his arm around her waist, steadying her in the saddle as they picked their way through the rugged terrain. Despite the pain, Molly found herself increasingly aware of his presence, the solid warmth of his chest against her back, the strength in the arm that held her securely, the clean scent of soap and leather that surrounded him. "Tell me about your reporting," he said after they had been riding for an hour, the silence between them comfortable but charged with unspoken things. Grateful for the distraction, Molly told him about her work for the Chronicle, how she had fought for years to be given serious assignments instead of society columns and recipes. "Editor finally gave me a chance with this landmark series," she explained. "Said if I could prove there was reader interest in something other than quilting bees and church socials, he'd consider letting me cover real news." "Like the Harker gang?" Kurt asked, amusement coloring his voice. "Exactly like the Harker gang," Molly confirmed. "Or bounty hunters who rescue foolish reporters from collapsed mines." His arm tightened fractionally around her waist. "I wouldn't call you foolish. Determined, perhaps, possibly reckless." "You sound like my father," Molly said with a laugh, then immediately regretted the comparison. "I hope not," Kurt replied, his voice suddenly closer to her ear. "Given the thoughts I've been having." The admission sent a rush of heat to Molly's cheeks, and she was grateful he couldn't see her face. Before she could formulate a response, the outline of Val Verde appeared in the distance, a small but growing town nestled against the backdrop of rolling hills. As they approached the outskirts, Molly became increasingly aware of her appearance and the potential for gossip. A respectable woman returning to town in the arms of a known bounty hunter, disheveled and injured, would provide fodder for talk for months. "Perhaps you could take me directly to the doctor," she suggested, "rather than through the main street." Kurt seemed to understand her concern immediately. "Of course. Doc Miller's place is on the edge of town anyway." True to his word, he guided his horse through the less populated areas of Val Verde until they reached a modest clapboard house with a small sign identifying it as the office of Dr. Thomas Miller. Kurt dismounted first, then gently lifted Molly down, supporting her as she tested her weight on her injured leg. "Still not good?" he asked, noting her grimace. "It's actually worse," she admitted reluctantly. Without hesitation, Kurt scooped her into his arms and carried her to the door, which he opened with a well-placed kick. "Doc Miller," he called. "Got a patient for you." A balding man with spectacles emerged from a back room, wiping his hands on a cloth. His eyebrows rose at the sight of them. "Miss Calloway, what in heaven's name happened to you?" "Mind collapse," Kurt answered for her, carrying Molly to the examination table. "Beam fell on her legs. I've cleaned the cuts, but there's significant bruising." The doctor approached, already rolling up his sleeves. "Set her down here, Kurt. Gently now." He turned to Molly. "I'll need to examine your legs properly, Miss Calloway. Perhaps Mr. Valentin should wait outside." Molly felt a flash of panic at the thought of Kurt leaving. "Actually, I'd prefer if he stayed," she said quickly, then added, "He's already treated the wounds initially. He should know if his field medicine was adequate." It was a flimsy excuse, but neither man questioned it. Kurt moved to stand at the head of the table, his presence reassuring as doctor. Miller cut away the blood-stained fabric of her skirt to reveal her injuries. The examination was thorough and painful. By the end, Molly's face was pale with exhaustion, and she was clutching Kurt's hand so tightly her knuckles were white. "No broken bones, thankfully, doctor," Miller pronounced finally, "but severe contusions and lacerations. You'll need complete rest for at least a week, preferably 2. And this leg," he indicated the right one with its massive bruise, "needs to be elevated and regularly treated with cold compresses to reduce the swelling." "A week." Molly repeated, dismayed. "Doctor, I have work to do. The newspaper will still be there when you're healed," the doctor interrupted firmly. "Unless you'd prefer to risk permanent damage," Molly subsided, though her frustration was evident. "Doctor." Miller cleaned and rebandaged her wounds, then mixed a powder in a glass of water. "For the pain," he explained, handing it to her. "Now, where shall I have you taken?" "Your boarding house," Molly hesitated. Mrs. Finch, her landlady, was a kind woman, but the boarding house had strict rules about male visitors and proper conduct. Having Kurt carry her to her room would cause a scandal, but she couldn't possibly manage the stairs alone. "I have a better idea," Kurt said unexpectedly. "The Val Verde Hotel has ground-floor rooms. I'll secure one for Miss Calloway and arrange for meals to be brought to her." "That's very kind," Molly began, "but I couldn't possibly consider it part of the rescue," Kurt interrupted with a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. "I'd sleep poorly knowing you were struggling up and down stairs and jeopardizing your recovery." Dr. Miller nodded approvingly. "An excellent solution. I'll visit daily to change the bandages." He turned to prepare a package of medical supplies, giving them a moment of privacy. "Thank you," Molly said quietly, still holding Kurt's hand. "For everything. I don't know how I'll ever repay you." Kurt's expression softened. "There's no debt between us, Molly, but if you insist." He paused, seeming to gather his courage. "Perhaps you could join me for dinner once you're well enough to leave your room. A proper dinner, not jerky by a campfire." The invitation surprised her, though perhaps it shouldn't have. There had been something building between them since the moment he'd carried her from the mine, a connection that transcended the circumstances of their meeting. "I'd like that very much," she replied, her voice steady despite the fluttering in her chest. The Val Verde Hotel was modest by city standards, but easily the finest establishment in town. Kurt carried Molly through the lobby, ignoring the curious stares of the desk clerk and the few guests lounging in the comfortable chairs. He secured a room with efficiency, paying in advance for a week. "The Chronicle will reimburse you," Molly insisted as he carried her down the hall to her room. "This is all because of a work assignment, after all." Kurt pushed open the door with his shoulder, revealing a pleasantly appointed room with a large bed, a small writing desk, and a window overlooking the hotel's garden. "Consider it my contribution to literary excellence," he said, carefully setting her on the bed. Once he was certain she was comfortable, Kurt stepped back, suddenly awkward. "I should go, let you rest." Molly found herself reluctant to see him leave. "Will you come back? To check on me, I mean." The question seemed to please him. "Try to keep me away," he said, his voice rough with an emotion she couldn't quite name. "But first, I have a gang to catch." The reminder of his dangerous profession sent a chill through Molly. "Be careful," she said, the words inadequate for the concern she felt. Kurt's expression warmed. "Always am." He moved to the door, then paused, turning back. "In case you were wondering, Miss Calloway, that mine shaft collapsed completely after we left. There's nothing left to investigate for your article." "Despite everything," Molly laughed. "Are you suggesting I might have tried to go back?" "The thought had crossed my mind," he admitted with a grin. "Rest well, Molly. I'll return soon." With that promise hanging in the air, he was gone, leaving Molly to contemplate how thoroughly her life had changed in the span of 24 hours. The first few days of Molly's confinement passed slowly. She split her time between sleeping, attempting to write notes for future articles, and watching the comings and goings in the garden below her window. Dr. Miller visited each morning to change her bandages and check her progress, reporting that she was healing well but still needed complete rest. The hotel staff brought her meals and treated her with a deference that suggested Kurt had been generous with his instructions, and likely his money. The desk clerk, A young man named Timothy even brought her a stack of books from the town's small lending library when he learned she was a writer. But there was no sign of Kurt. Each time there was a knock at her door, Molly's heart leapt, only to settle back in disappointment when it was Dr. Miller or one of the hotel staff. By the fourth day, she had begun to wonder if he had forgotten his promise or worse, if something had happened to him during his pursuit of the Harker gang. On the morning of the fifth day, Dr. Miller arrived with news along with his medical bag. "Seems our Mr. Valentin has been busy," he said as he unwrapped the bandages from Molly's legs. "Brought in 2 of the Harker brothers yesterday afternoon, quite a stir at the sheriff's office." Molly sat up straighter. "He's back in town. Is he all right?" The doctor's eyes twinkled knowingly. "A few scrapes and bruises. Nothing serious. Said he'd be by to see you once he'd cleaned up and gotten some rest." Relief flooded through her, followed quickly by self-consciousness. She hadn't been able to properly bathe since the accident, making do with a basin of water and a cloth. Her hair was a tangled mess, and she had been wearing the same nightgown for days, with only a shawl to cover her shoulders when she had visitors. Dr. Miller seemed to sense her distress. "The swelling in your legs has gone down considerably. I believe a proper bath would be possible now, if you're careful not to soak the deeper wounds." "That would be wonderful," Molly sighed gratefully. "I'll have the hotel staff prepare it for you," he promised, finishing with the fresh bandages. "And perhaps see if they can find you something fresh to wear. Can't have you receiving your hero looking anything less than your best." Molly blushed at his teasing but didn't contradict him. Within an hour, 2 maids had brought a copper-hip bath and filled it with steaming water, adding a generous amount of lavender-scented bath salts. They helped her undress and ease into the bath, then left her with promises to return with clean linens and to help her wash her hair. The warm water was heavenly against Molly's skin, easing the aches that lingered in her muscles from days of limited movement. She soaked until the water began to cool, then allowed the maids to help her wash and dress in a borrowed nightgown that was much finer than her own, with delicate lace at the collar and cuffs. "The hotel owner's wife sent it over," one of the maids explained as they helped Molly back to bed, which now boasted fresh sheets and plumped pillows. "Along with this." She held up a silk dressing gown in a soft shade of blue. Once Molly was settled, her damp hair brushed and braided, and the bath cleared away, she felt more like herself than she had in days. The borrowed garments made her feel almost elegant, despite her circumstances. It was late afternoon when a knock sounded at her door, different from Dr. Miller's polite tap or the maid's timid knocking. This was firm, confident. "Come in," Molly called, hastily checking that her dressing gown was properly arranged over her nightgown. The door opened to reveal Kurt, and the sight of him made her breath catch. He had indeed cleaned up. His usually unruly hair was neatly combed, his face freshly shaven, and he wore a clean shirt and vest instead of his trail-worn clothes. In his arms, he carried a bouquet of wildflowers and what appeared to be a basket covered with a cloth. "Miss Calloway," he said formally, though his eyes were warm as they took in her appearance. "You're looking well." "As are you, Mr. Valentin," she replied, matching his tone but unable to suppress a smile. "I hear congratulations are in order. 2 of the Harker brothers captured." Kurt set the flowers on the bedside table and placed the basket on the foot of her bed. "News travels fast in Val Verde." "One of the benefits of small-town life," Molly agreed, "though it does make it difficult to maintain any privacy." A shadow crossed Kurt's face. "I hope my arranging this room for you hasn't caused any talk." Molly shook her head. "Dr. Miller has been very clear with anyone who asks that this was a medical necessity. Besides, Val Verde may be small, but it's not provincial. People understand emergencies. Kurt relaxed visibly. Good. I wouldn't want to cause you any professional difficulties. He gestured to the basket. I brought dinner. Thought you might be tired of hotel fare. That's very thoughtful, Molly said, genuinely touched. What's on the menu? Kurt began unpacking the basket, revealing an impressive spread of cold chicken, fresh bread, cheese, apples, and a bottle of wine. Nothing fancy, but better than jerky. It looks wonderful, Molly assured him. She started to shift her position, wincing slightly as her legs protested. Kurt was at her side immediately. Let me help you. With gentle efficiency, he arranged the pillows behind her so she could sit more comfortably, then placed a napkin across her lap. His hands were calloused but gentle, and Molly found herself acutely aware of each point of contact between them. Thank you, she murmured, suddenly shy under his attentive gaze. Kurt pulled the desk chair close to the bed and set about serving their meal, pouring wine into 2 glasses he'd brought in the basket. To your recovery, he said, raising his glass. And to successful bounty hunting, Molly added, touching her glass to his. As they ate, Kurt told her about his pursuit of the Harker brothers, how he'd tracked them to an abandoned homestead 20 miles outside of town, waited until nightfall, then surprised them as they slept. The oldest brother, James, put up quite a fight, Kurt admitted, rolling up his sleeve to show a long scratch on his forearm. But in the end, they came quietly enough. And the third brother, Molly asked, picking at her chicken. Still out there, Kurt said, his expression darkening. Cole Harker's the dangerous one, cunning and ruthless. The others were just following his lead. Will you go after him? Kurt nodded, taking a sip of his wine. As soon as I deliver James and William to the federal marshal in Austin. There's a substantial bounty on all 3, but Cole's the real prize. The thought of Kurt pursuing another dangerous criminal so soon sent a wave of anxiety through Molly. When do you leave for Austin? Day after tomorrow, he replied, studying her face. But I'll be back. Got unfinished business in Val Verde now. The implication hung in the air between them, charged with possibility. Molly busied herself with her wine glass, not trusting herself to respond without revealing too much. Kurt cleared his throat. How's your recovery progressing? Doc Miller seemed pleased when I spoke to him this morning. Grateful for the change of subject, Molly told him about her improving mobility and the doctor's prediction that she would be able to return to light duties at the newspaper within another week. Though he's forbidden me from investigating any more historic sites without an escort, she added ruefully. Wise man, Kurt said with a smile that transformed his rugged features, making him look younger and more carefree than she'd yet seen him. Though I'd be happy to volunteer for escort duty once you're back on your feet. Would you? Molly asked, surprised and pleased. I wouldn't have thought old buildings and local history would interest a man like you. Kurt's eyebrow rose. A man like me, Molly flushed. I just meant someone who lives such an adventurous life, tracking criminals across the frontier. It seems a far cry from documenting old mines and abandoned homesteads. There was a time I thought I'd be a teacher, Kurt said unexpectedly, refilling their wine glasses. Before the war. Studied history at a small college in Pennsylvania. The revelation surprised Molly. What happened? Kurt's expression grew distant. Life, war, the usual disruptions. He shook his head slightly as if to clear away unwanted memories. But I've never lost my interest in the past. Especially out here, where everything has a story, every abandoned mine, every ghost town, every trail leading nowhere. Molly found herself captivated by this glimpse of a different Kurt Valentin, not just the capable bounty hunter who had saved her life, but a man with depths and interests she hadn't suspected. I'd like that, she said softly. Having you along on my explorations, once I'm well. Kurt held her gaze, something unspoken passing between them. It's a date, then. They finished their meal in comfortable conversation, touching on books they'd both read, places they'd seen, and their respective childhoods. Kurt's on a small farm in Pennsylvania, Molly's in the bustling city of St. Louis. As the evening lengthened, Molly found herself reluctant for it to end. Even as fatigue began to pull at her, Kurt noticed her stifling a yawn. "I should go," he said, beginning to pack away the remains of their dinner. "You need your rest." "I've done nothing but rest for 5 days," Molly protested, but another yawn betrayed her. Kurt smiled knowingly. "Healing takes energy." He stood, gathering the basket. "I'll come by tomorrow before I leave for Austin. Is there anything you need? Books, writing materials?" "Just your safe return," Molly said, then blushed at her own boldness. Kurt's expression softened. He set the basket down and moved to her bedside, taking her hand in his. "Molly Calloway," he said, his voice low and intense. "I have faced outlaws, Apache warriors, and Confederate sharpshooters, and somehow survived them all. I have no intention of letting Cole Harker change that record." Before she could respond, he raised her hand to his lips and pressed a kiss to her knuckles, a gesture both courtly and deeply intimate. "Rest well," he murmured against her skin, then released her hand and collected the basket. At the door he paused, looking back at her with an expression that made her heart race. "Dream of me," he said simply, and then he was gone. Molly stared at the closed door, her hand still tingling where his lips had touched it. "I will," she whispered to the empty room. The day of Kurt's departure dawned bright and clear, with the kind of perfect blue sky that seemed unique to Texas. Molly had been awake since first light, alternating between anticipation and anxiety about seeing Kurt again before he left for Austin. Dr. Miller arrived for his usual morning visit, pleased with the continued improvement in her injuries. "Another week of rest should see you well enough to return to work, though I'd advise against any strenuous activity for at least a month." "Does walking count as strenuous?" Molly asked hopefully. "I'm going mad being confined to this room." The doctor considered. "A short walk in the garden might be beneficial if you're careful and use a cane for support." He reached into his bag and produced a polished wooden walking stick. "My wife's father's. She thought you might have need of it." Touched by the kindness, Molly accepted the cane. "Please thank her for me." After Dr. Miller left, Molly decided to attempt the walk to the garden immediately. She dressed carefully in her own clothes, which the hotel staff had cleaned and mended as best they could, though her skirt still showed signs of her ordeal. Using the cane for support, she made her slow way down the hallway and through the hotel's back door to the small but well-tended garden. The fresh air was intoxicating after days indoors. Molly found a bench beneath a flowering magnolia tree and settled there, lifting her face to the sun. Around her, bees hummed among the flowers and birds called from the trees. After the sterile confines of her hotel room, the garden seemed alive with color and sound. "You're a sight for sore eyes," said a familiar voice. Molly opened her eyes to find Kurt standing before her, dressed for travel in his trail clothes, his hat in his hands. "I went to your room, but you'd flown the coop," he continued with a smile. "Dr. Miller said a short walk would do me good," Molly explained, suddenly conscious of her mended clothes and wind-tousled hair. Kurt's gaze was appreciative as it traveled over her. "He was right. You look vibrant." A flush of pleasure warmed Molly's cheeks. "Thank you, and you look ready for the road." "Almost." Kurt sat beside her on the bench, close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. "Just one piece of unfinished business before I go." There was something in his voice that sent a shiver of anticipation through Molly. "Oh," Kurt turned to face her, his expression serious. I've been thinking about what happened at the mine, how close you came to." He paused, seemingly unable to voice the possibility of her death. "It made me realize how quickly life can change or end, how foolish it is to waste time." Molly's heart began to race. "Kurt, let me finish," he said gently, taking her hands in his. "I know we've only known each other a short while. I know this might seem sudden or even inappropriate. But I've lived long enough to recognize something real when I find it." He took a deep breath. "I care for you, Molly Calloway, more than I thought possible in such a short time, and I'd like permission to court you properly when I return from Austin." Of all the things Molly had imagined Kurt might say before leaving, this formal request had not been among them. It was so unexpected, so earnest, that for a moment she could only stare at him in wonder. I don't know what to say," she admitted finally. A shadow crossed Kurt's face. "If it's too soon or if you don't feel—" "No," Molly interrupted, squeezing his hands. "That's not it at all. I'm just surprised, pleasantly so." She met his gaze directly, her own feelings crystallizing in that moment. "Yes, Kurt Valentin, I would be honored to be courted by you." The smile that broke across his face was like the sunrise, warm and full of promise. Without warning, he leaned forward and pressed his lips to hers in a kiss that was both gentle and fervent, his hand coming up to cup her cheek with infinite tenderness. When he pulled away, Molly felt as though the world had shifted on its axis. Everything looked brighter, more vivid, the flowers more colorful, the sky more blue, the future more full of possibility than it had ever seemed before. "I'll be back within a fortnight," Kurt promised, his voice husky with emotion. "Sooner if I can manage it." "I'll be waiting," Molly replied, her own voice unsteady. "Be careful, Kurt, please." He kissed her once more, briefly but with no less feeling. "Count on it." With visible reluctance, Kurt rose from the bench and settled his hat on his head. "Write to me at the marshal's office in Austin if you're able. I'd welcome news of your recovery." "I will," Molly promised. Kurt touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that had become familiar and dear to her. "Until we meet again, Miss Calloway." As she watched him walk away, Molly felt a curious mixture of joy and apprehension. The joy was easy to understand. Kurt Valentin wanted to court her, and she had discovered feelings for him that went far beyond gratitude for her rescue. But the apprehension came from the dangerous nature of his work, and the knowledge that while she sat safely in Val Verde, he would be pursuing a violent criminal. "Come back to me," she whispered as his figure disappeared from view. The days that followed Kurt's departure were both easier and harder than those that had preceded it. Easier because Molly's physical recovery progressed rapidly. She graduated from short walks in the garden to longer excursions into town, eventually returning to her boarding house and her desk at the Val Verde Chronicle. Harder because each day without word from Kurt stretched her nerves a little tighter. Each passing stagecoach or rider from the direction of Austin made her heart leap with anticipation. Her editor at the Chronicle, Mr. Holloway, was surprisingly understanding about her accident and recovery. "Got a fine story out of it, though," he said gruffly when she returned to work. "Local bounty hunter rescues lady reporter from certain death. Could sell that tale to those penny dreadfuls they publish back east." Molly had indeed written an account of the mine collapse and her rescue, though she had been careful to focus on the historical aspects of the mine and the danger of unstable structures rather than the personal elements of her experience. The article had been well received, and Mr. Holloway had agreed to let her continue the Landmark series, provided she took proper precautions in the future. She wrote to Kurt as promised, sending letters to the marshal's office in Austin that detailed her recovery, the reception of her article, and the small happenings of Val Verde. She kept her tone light and newsy, though she longed to express the deeper feelings that grew stronger with each day of separation. A week after Kurt's departure, a reply arrived, a brief note saying he had delivered the Harker brothers to justice and was now tracking Cole, who had been spotted near the border with Mexico. The letter was short on personal sentiments, but Molly reminded herself that Kurt was a man of action rather than words, and that he was likely writing in haste between stages of his pursuit. 2 weeks became 3 with no further word, and no sign of Kurt returning to Val Verde. Molly threw herself into her work, researching and writing articles about the town's first schoolhouse, the old Spanish mission on the outskirts, and the original trading post that had given rise to the settlement. She visited these sites accompanied by Timothy from the hotel, who had appointed himself her unofficial protector in Kurt's absence. It was during one such expedition, as they were examining the crumbling walls of the mission, that Timothy suddenly stiffened beside her. "Miss Calloway," he said in a low voice, "I think we should return to town now." Molly looked up from her notebook. "Why, I haven't finished my notes on the architecture." Timothy's face was pale. "There's a man watching us from those trees. He's been there since we arrived, and he's carrying a rifle." A chill ran down Molly's spine as she casually glanced in the direction Timothy indicated. Sure enough, a figure could be seen among the mesquite trees that bordered the mission grounds, a man on horseback, partially obscured by shadows but definitely observing them. It could be a rancher checking his boundary, Molly suggested, though she didn't believe it. Or a traveler resting in the shade. Timothy shook his head. "No, madam, he's been too still and he's keeping out of sight deliberately." The young man squared his shoulders. "We need to leave. Now." Molly nodded, closing her notebook and gathering her things with hands that trembled slightly. They made their way back to the buggy they had hired for the day, trying to appear unhurried while keeping the mission building between themselves and the watching stranger. As Timothy helped her into the buggy, Molly cast one last glance toward the trees. The man was gone. Somehow, that was more unsettling than his presence had been. "Drive quickly," she urged Timothy as he climbed up beside her. They had traveled perhaps half a mile when the sound of hoofbeats approached rapidly from behind them. Timothy flicked the reins, urging their horse to a faster pace, but the road was rough and the buggy bounced alarmingly. "It's no use," Molly said, gripping the seat as they jounced over a particularly deep rut. "We can't outrun a rider." The hoofbeats grew louder and then a voice called out, "Miss Calloway." "Timothy, hold up." The voice was familiar, but not the one Molly had been hoping to hear for weeks. It belonged to Sheriff Davis, Val Verde's aging but still capable lawman. Timothy pulled the buggy to a halt as the sheriff rode alongside. "Afternoon, Sheriff," Molly said, trying to hide her relief. "Is something wrong?" Sheriff Davis removed his hat, wiping sweat from his brow. "Thought I should warn you, Cole Harker's been spotted in the area." Timothy's face paled further. "The outlaw, the one Mr. Valentin was tracking," "The very same," the sheriff confirmed grimly. "Got word from Austin this morning. Harker gave Valentin the slip down near Lerdo, then doubled back this way." He gave Molly a significant look. "Word is he's mighty upset about his brothers being taken in." A cold knot formed in Molly's stomach. "And he knows Kurt Valentin was responsible." The sheriff nodded. "Worse, he might know about you. Valentin's connection to Val Verde wasn't exactly a secret during the trial in Austin. Your article about the mine rescue was mentioned." "You think Cole Harker might come after Miss Calloway?" Timothy asked, his voice cracking slightly. "It's a possibility we can't ignore," Sheriff Davis said gravely. "These outlaws, they take things personal, and Harker's known for holding grudges." Molly thought of the watching figure at the mission. "Sheriff, There was a man observing us just now from the trees near the old mission." The sheriff's hand moved to his gun. "You sure?" Timothy noticed him first. "When we left, he was gone." Sheriff Davis turned his horse, scanning the road behind them. "I'll check it out. Meanwhile, you two get back to town. Miss Calloway, I think it best if you stay somewhere secure until we know more. Maybe with friends, not your usual boarding house." "She can stay at the hotel," Timothy offered immediately. "We've still got her old room available, and there's always someone at the front desk." The sheriff nodded approval. "Good thinking. I'll post a deputy nearby, just in case." He settled his hat back on his head. "Don't mean to frighten you, Miss Calloway, but better safe than sorry." "I understand," Molly said, though her heart was racing with fear not for herself, but for Kurt. If Cole Harker had eluded him and returned to Val Verde, what did that mean for Kurt's safety? "Has there been any word from Mr. Valentin directly?" The sheriff's expression softened with sympathy. "Not since he reported losing Harker's trail 3 days ago. But Valentin's a capable man. If anyone can handle themselves against the likes of Cole Harker, it's him." With that meager reassurance, the sheriff tipped his hat and rode back toward the mission, while Timothy urged their horse to a faster pace toward town. As they traveled, Molly stared at the passing landscape without really seeing it, her mind filled with images of Kurt facing danger alone, perhaps injured or worse. The possibility that Cole Harker might target her seemed almost secondary to her fears for Kurt's safety. By the time they reached Val Verde, the sun was setting, painting the town in shades of gold and amber that reminded Molly painfully of her first evening with Kurt at his campsite. Timothy delivered her directly to the hotel as promised, and the staff welcomed her back with concerned efficiency, quickly preparing her old room and arranging for her belongings to be collected from the boarding house. That night, as Molly lay in the familiar bed where she had begun her recovery, sleep eluded her. Each creak of the hotel's wooden structure, each distant sound from the street below, set her nerves on edge. She found herself straining to hear hoofbeats, to catch the sound of Kurt's voice calling her name, announcing his safe return. Instead, shortly after midnight, she heard gunshots, 3 in rapid succession, followed by shouting and the sound of running feet. Molly rushed to the window, her injured leg protesting the sudden movement. The street below was in chaos, with people emerging from buildings to see what had happened. In the distance, near the sheriff's office, lanterns bobbed as a crowd gathered. A knock at her door made Molly jump. "Miss Calloway," Timothy's voice called. "Are you all right?" She opened the door to find the young man in his nightshirt, a pistol gripped awkwardly in his hand. "I'm fine," she assured him. "What's happening?" "Not sure," Timothy admitted. "Something at the sheriff's office." Mr. Jenkins went to find out. Mr. Jenkins was the night clerk, an elderly man who seemed to subsist entirely on coffee and gossip. "I need to know what's going on," Molly said, already reaching for her shawl. Timothy's eyes widened. "You can't go out there." "Sheriff Davis said you should stay secure." "I'm a reporter, Timothy," Molly reminded him gently. "This is my job." Seeing his continued distress, she added, "We'll be careful. Just to the end of the street to see what's happening, please." Reluctantly, Timothy agreed, waiting outside her door while she dressed hastily. Together, they made their way through the hotel and out onto the street, staying close to the buildings and moving cautiously toward the gathering crowd. Before they reached the sheriff's office, they encountered Mr. Jenkins hurrying back, his face animated with excitement. "Cole Harker," he announced breathlessly as he spotted them. "He tried to break his brothers out of the jail. Sheriff Davis shot him, but he got away." Molly's heart leapt. "Is anyone hurt?" "Deputy Wilson took a bullet in the shoulder," Mr. Jenkins reported, clearly relishing his role as newsbearer. Doc Miller's with him now. They think Harker's wounded too left a trail of blood heading out of town. Which direction? Molly asked, her journalist's instincts taking over. Mr. Jenkins pointed north. Toward the old Hammond place, looks like. Sheriff's organizing a posse to go after him come first light. The old Hammond place, an abandoned homestead that had been on Molly's list of landmarks to document. She had notes on its location, its history, even a rough sketch of the layout that she'd compiled from town records. A plan began to form in her mind, reckless, possibly foolish, but driven by her fear for Kurt and her determination not to be a passive victim waiting for Cole Harker to find her. "Thank you, Mr. Jenkins," she said, already turning back toward the hotel. "Timothy, I think I should return to my room now." The young man looked relieved at her sudden compliance, not noticing the determined set of her jaw or the calculation in her eyes. As they walked back, Molly began mentally inventorying what she would need and how soon she could set her plan in motion. If Kurt was still tracking Cole Harker, he would eventually follow the outlaw back to Val Verde. And if Harker was indeed hiding at the Hammond place, wounded and desperate, that's where Kurt would find him. Which meant that's where Molly needed to be, not to confront Harker herself, but to ensure that Kurt had all the information he needed to approach the homestead safely. It was a dangerous gamble, but as Kurt himself had said, life could change or end in an instant. Molly was no longer content to sit safely in town while the man she had come to love faced danger alone. Tomorrow, before the sheriff's posse set out, she would make her own way to the Hammond place and do what she could to help bring Cole Harker to justice and bring Kurt Valentin safely back to her. Dawn was just breaking when Molly slipped out of the hotel through the kitchen entrance, where deliveries were made and staff came and went without notice. She had dressed in her sturdiest clothes, packed a small bag with essentials, and borrowed a horse from the livery stable, using her credentials from the Chronicle as justification for the early rental. Her plan was simple but risky. Reach the Hammond homestead ahead of the sheriff's posse, observe from a safe distance to confirm if Cole Harker was indeed hiding there, then either return to town with the information, or if she encountered Kurt on the way, share her knowledge of the layout directly with him. The risk came not just from the possibility of encountering Harker himself, but from the condition of her still healing legs. The ride would be painful, and if she needed to move quickly or defend herself, her mobility would be compromised. Still, Molly felt the gamble was worth taking. She had spent too many days waiting passively for news of Kurt, too many nights worrying about his safety while doing nothing to help. The Hammond place lay about 5 miles north of Val Verde, nestled in a small valley surrounded by rolling hills. According to Molly's research, it had been abandoned nearly a decade earlier when drought forced the family to sell their cattle and move east. The homestead itself consisted of a modest house, a barn, and several outbuildings, all gradually succumbing to the elements but still providing potential shelter. As Molly rode, the rising sun warmed her back, and the familiar ache in her legs settled into a manageable discomfort. She kept to the main trail initially, then veered onto a less traveled path that wound through a stand of mesquite trees, approaching the Hammond place from the east rather than the more obvious southern approach from town. She tethered her horse in a grove of trees about a quarter-mile from the homestead, ensuring the animal had water from her canteen before proceeding on foot. The walking stick doctor Miller had lent her served as both support and potential weapon as she made her careful way through the brush, mindful of every snapping twig and rustling leaf. From a small rise overlooking the homestead, Molly settled behind a large rock and raised the small field glasses she had borrowed from the Chronicle's stores. Through them, she could clearly see the main house with its sagging porch and the barn whose roof had partially collapsed. There was no sign of movement, no horses in the corral, nothing to suggest occupation. Yet as she continued to watch, a thin wisp of smoke rose from the house's chimney, almost imperceptible against the pale morning sky, but definitely there. Someone was inside, being careful not to announce their presence. Molly lowered the field glasses, her heart racing. Cole Harker was here, just as the sheriff had suspected. The wounded outlaw had sought refuge in this isolated spot, probably planning to rest and recover before continuing his flight. If Kurt was still on his trail, this is where he would come. The question now was what to do next. Return to town to inform Sheriff Davis. Wait here in the hope of intercepting Kurt. Or try to get closer, to gather more information that might be useful. Prudence dictated returning to town immediately. But as Molly began to rise from her hiding place, movement caught her eye, a rider approaching the homestead from the west, moving slowly and with clear caution. Even at this distance, there was something familiar about his posture, about the set of his shoulders and the way he held himself in the saddle. Kurt. Relief and fear crashed through Molly in equal measure. He was alive, apparently unharmed, and he had tracked Cole Harker to the Hammond place just as she had anticipated. But he was also alone, approaching a desperate, cornered outlaw without backup. Molly raised the field glasses again, focusing on Kurt as he dismounted and tethered his horse in much the same way she had, though on the opposite side of the property. She watched as he drew his revolver and began a careful approach to the house, using the outbuildings for cover. She needed to warn him that Harker was definitely inside, needed to share her knowledge of the homestead's layout. But calling out would alert Harker to both their positions. She would have to intercept Kurt somehow, approach him silently before he reached the house. Moving as quickly as her injured legs would allow, Molly began making her way down the slope toward the homestead, keeping to the cover of rocks and brush. Her plan was to circle around behind the barn, where Kurt was heading, and catch his attention before he moved into a more exposed position. She had almost reached the first outbuilding when disaster struck. A loose stone rolled under her foot, sending her stumbling forward with a startled cry that seemed impossibly loud in the morning stillness. She managed to catch herself before falling, but the damage was done. From the direction of the house came the sharp crack of a rifle shot, followed by the splintering of wood near where Kurt had been moving. Molly's heart stopped as she saw Kurt dive for cover behind a water trough, returning fire with his revolver. "Valentin," a harsh voice called from the house. "I knew you'd come. Followed my trail like a good little bloodhound." Kurt didn't respond, but Molly saw him moving along the trough, trying to get a better angle on the house. Another shot rang out, closer to his position. "I got your girl out there too," Harker shouted. "Saw her watching from the hill. Thought I didn't notice, did she?" Molly froze, realizing with horror that Harker had been aware of her presence all along. Kurt's head snapped up, scanning the area around the homestead, his expression a mixture of disbelief and fear when he spotted her half hidden beside the outbuilding. "Molly," he called, his voice strained with tension. "What in God's name?" "I'm sorry," she called back, her voice shaking. "I came to warn you." Another shot from the house, this one kicking up dirt near Molly's feet. She gasped and pressed herself against the wall of the outbuilding. "Now I got both of you." Harker's voice held savage satisfaction. "The bounty hunter and his woman, fitting payment for my brothers." Kurt's face hardened with determination. "Molly, stay where you are," he shouted. "Don't move." To Harker he called, "It's over, Cole. Sheriff's got a posse on the way. You won't make it out of this valley alive unless you surrender." Harker's laugh was ugly. "Maybe not." But I'll take you both with me. Molly's mind raced. She was trapped, exposed if she tried to reach Kurt's position, but also vulnerable where she stood. Kurt was pinned down as well, unable to approach the house without crossing open ground that Harker could easily cover with his rifle. Then she remembered the layout of the Hammond place from her research. The house had a cellar accessible from outside, a storm cellar with doors that opened at ground level behind the kitchen. If she could reach those doors unseen, she might be able to enter the house and create a distraction that would allow Kurt to move in. It was a desperate plan, born of fear and adrenaline, but it was better than remaining passive targets for Harker's rifle. Keeping close to the wall of the outbuilding, Molly began moving toward the back of the property, using the sparse cover available. She caught Kurt's eye and pointed urgently toward the rear of the house, then mimed opening doors at ground level. His eyes widened in understanding, then narrowed in clear disapproval. He shook his head vehemently, but Molly was already moving, staying low and using every bit of cover she could find. Another shot from the house, but this one was directed at Kurt, who returned fire to keep Harker's attention focused on him rather than Molly's movement along the perimeter of the property. The pain in Molly's legs was excruciating now, each step sending jolts of agony through her barely healed wounds, but she pushed forward, driven by determination and fear for Kurt's safety. She reached the back of the house without drawing fire, and there, just as she had expected, were the slanted doors of the cellar. Heart pounding, she eased one of the doors open, grimacing at the creak of rusted hinges. The space below was dark and smelled of damp earth. Wooden steps led down into shadows. Taking a deep breath, Molly descended into the cellar, using her walking stick to probe ahead for obstacles. The cellar was small and mostly empty, with shelves along one wall that might once have held preserves, but now contained only dust and cobwebs. A narrow staircase at the far end presumably led up into the house. Molly made her way toward it, straining to hear movement above. The floorboards overhead creaked as someone Harker moved across them. She could hear the muffled sound of his voice as he continued to shout threats and taunts at Kurt. Carefully, Molly began to ascend the inner stairs, testing each step before putting her full weight on it. At the top was a door. Closed but probably not locked, there would be little need for security between the cellar and kitchen in a family home. Molly paused, gathering her courage. Once she opened this door, there would be no turning back. From outside came the sound of more gunfire, followed by a cry of pain that might have been Kurt's. The possibility galvanized Molly into action. She threw open the cellar door and lunged into the kitchen, brandishing her walking stick like a club. The kitchen was empty, but through a doorway she could see into the main room of the house, where Cole Harker stood by a window, rifle raised. His back was to her, his attention focused entirely on the yard where Kurt was pinned down. Without giving herself time to reconsider, Molly raised her walking stick and brought it down with all her strength on Harker's shoulders. The outlaw howled in pain and surprise, his rifle discharging harmlessly into the ceiling as he staggered forward. He whirled to face Molly, his expression contorted with fury. "You little," before he could finish, the front door burst open and Kurt charged in, revolver aimed directly at Harker's chest. "Drop it, Cole." For a moment, the tableau held Harker half-turned between them, his rifle still in his hands, Kurt in the doorway, steady and deadly. Molly with her walking stick raised for another blow if needed. Then Harker moved, swinging the rifle toward Kurt. 2 shots rang out in rapid succession, and Harker crumpled to the floor, blood blooming across his shirt from wounds in his chest and shoulder. Kurt was at Molly's side in an instant, pulling her away from the fallen outlaw and checking her for injuries. "Are you hurt?" Did he touch you?" "I'm fine," Molly assured him, though in truth she felt light-headed and nauseated from the violence and the strain on her healing legs. "Are you? I heard you cry out, caught a splinter when his shot hit the trough," Kurt said dismissively, showing a small gash on his cheek. "Nothing serious." He turned to check on Harker, but it was immediately clear that the outlaw was beyond help. The shots had found their mark with deadly accuracy, and Cole, Harker had joined his long list of victims in death. Kurt holstered his revolver and turned back to Molly, his expression a complex mixture of relief, residual fear, and simmering anger. "What were you thinking?" he demanded, his hands gripping her shoulders. "Coming out here alone, putting yourself in danger." "I was thinking of you," Molly interrupted, her own emotions bubbling to the surface. "Weeks without word, then hearing Cole Harker was in the area, possibly looking for me, I couldn't just sit in town and wait." "That's exactly what you should have done." Kurt's voice rose with the force of his concern. "If anything had happened to you—" Whatever he might have said next was lost as hoofbeats approached outside, announcing the arrival of Sheriff Davis and his posse. Kurt released Molly with a sigh that suggested their discussion was far from over, and moved to the door to signal the newcomers. The next hour passed in a blur of activity as the sheriff and his men secured the scene, confirmed Harker's death, and prepared to transport his body back to town. Kurt gave a concise report of what had happened, tactfully minimizing Molly's role in the confrontation, while ensuring the sheriff understood the danger Harker had posed. Throughout it all, Molly sat on the sagging porch of the Hammond place, exhaustion and reaction setting in as the adrenaline of the morning wore off. Her legs throbbed mercilessly, and she suspected she had set back her recovery by weeks, if not months. But as she watched Kurt efficiently directing the posse's activities, alive and largely unharmed, she couldn't bring herself to regret her actions. Eventually, Kurt approached her, his expression softened from anger to concern. He crouched before her, taking her hands in his. "Can you ride?" Molly nodded, though she wasn't entirely sure it was true. "I made it here, didn't I?" The ghost of a smile touched Kurt's lips. "That you did, Miss Calloway. That you did." He stood and helped her to her feet, supporting her when her right leg threatened to buckle. "I'll take you back to town. Get you to Doc Miller. The sheriff and his men can handle Harker." He lifted her onto his horse with the same care he had shown when rescuing her from the mine, then mounted behind her, his arms creating a secure circle around her as he took the reins. As they rode away from the Hammond place, Molly leaned back against his chest, drawing strength and comfort from his solid presence. "I was so afraid for you," she admitted quietly as they traveled. Kurt's arms tightened fractionally around her. "And I for you when I saw you there," he replied, his voice close to her ear. "Thought my heart would stop." "I'm sorry for frightening you," Molly said, "but not for coming. I couldn't bear not knowing if you were safe, not doing anything to help." Kurt was silent for a long moment, and Molly feared he was still angry. Then he sighed, a sound of surrender rather than frustration. "You're the most courageous woman I've ever known, Molly Calloway. Foolhardy and reckless, perhaps, but brave beyond measure." He pressed a kiss to her temple, his lips lingering against her skin. "And God help me, I love you for it, for all of it." The declaration, so simply stated yet so profound, brought tears to Molly's eyes. "I love you too," she whispered, the words carrying easily to him in the quiet of the morning. "I think I have since you carried me from that mine." Kurt's arms tightened around her once more, and they rode the rest of the way to Val Verde in a silence that held more meaning than any words could convey. Dr. Miller was not pleased with the state of Molly's legs when Kurt carried her into his office later that morning. "What part of complete rest was unclear, Miss Calloway?" he demanded, as he examined the fresh damage. "You've torn open 2 of the deeper cuts, and this bruising suggests you may have strained the muscles further." "It was necessary, doctor," Molly replied, unrepentant despite the pain, "and I don't regret it." The doctor glanced between her and Kurt, who stood by the examination table with his hat in his hands, his expression a mix of concern and barely concealed pride. "I see," Dr. Miller said dryly. "Well, the good news is that with proper care, and I do mean proper this time, you should still recover fully. But it will take longer now, and you'll need to be more careful with that right leg. The muscle damage was significant to begin with, and you've aggravated it considerably." "I understand," Molly said, properly chastened by the thought of prolonging her recovery. "She'll rest," Kurt promised. "I'll see to it personally." Dr. Miller raised an eyebrow at this declaration but made no comment as he rebandaged Molly's legs and prepared a powder for pain. "Bed rest for at least 3 days, he instructed. "Then very limited movement for another week, and no more horseback riding or confronting outlaws until I give my express permission. Is that clear?" "Perfectly, doctor," Molly agreed, though the twinkle in her eye suggested she found his phrasing amusing. Kurt escorted her back to the hotel, carrying her to her room despite her protests that she could manage with the walking stick. "Humor me," he said as he set her gently on the bed. "I've had enough excitement for one day without watching you struggle up those stairs." Once she was settled, he pulled a chair close to the bedside and sat, removing his hat and running a hand through his hair in a gesture that spoke of exhaustion. Now that they were alone and the immediate danger had passed, Molly could see the toll the past weeks had taken on him, the new lines around his eyes, the weight he had lost, the shadows of fatigue that marked his face. "You need rest too," she observed softly. Kurt smiled wryly. "I've been on Harker's trail for nearly a month. Sleep wasn't a priority." "And now?" Molly asked, reaching out to take his hand. "Now," Kurt replied, lacing his fingers through hers, "I find myself with an unexpected future to consider. The Harker gang was my last assignment. I was planning to collect the bounty and then—" He trailed off, seeming uncertain for the first time since Molly had known him. "Then," she prompted gently. Kurt met her gaze directly. "Then find somewhere to settle. I'm 34 years old, Molly. I've spent the last decade tracking the worst men the West has to offer. I'm tired of the killing, the constant moving, the loneliness of the trail." His thumb traced patterns on the back of her hand. "When I pulled you from that mine, I wasn't just saving your life. Something in me recognized you, not your face or your name, but your spirit, like I'd been looking for you without knowing it." The simple honesty of his words touched Molly deeply. "I felt it too," she admitted. "That's why I couldn't bear to just wait in town, not knowing if you were safe. It felt like part of myself was missing." Kurt raised her hand to his lips, pressing a kiss to her knuckles much as he had done the night before he left for Austin. "I meant what I said earlier. I love you, Molly Calloway. I know it's fast, perhaps too fast for propriety's sake, but I'm not a man who wastes time when he knows his mind." "Nor am I a woman who hesitates when her heart is certain," Molly replied, her voice steady despite the emotion that threatened to overwhelm her. "I love you too, Kurt Valentin." The smile that spread across Kurt's face was transformative, erasing years of hardship and solitude. He leaned forward and kissed her, a proper kiss this time. Not the cautious press of lips they had shared in the garden before his departure, but a true expression of the love that had grown between them. When they parted, both slightly breathless, Kurt rested his forehead against hers. "I need to return to Austin to collect the bounty on Cole Harker," he said reluctantly. "It should take no more than a week, but when I return—" He hesitated, then straightened, his expression solemn. When I return, I hope you'll consider becoming my wife." Though she had begun to suspect this was where their conversation was heading, the actual proposal still took Molly's breath away. "Are you certain?" she asked, searching his face. "Your life has been so different from mine, so much more free," Kurt supplied with a smile. "Perhaps. But freedom without purpose becomes its own kind of prison after a while. I've found my purpose, Molly. It's here with you." His smile faded into seriousness once more. "If you'll have me." Molly didn't hesitate. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, Kurt Valentin, I will marry you." The joy that filled her at his answering smile was unlike anything she had ever experienced, a completeness, a sense of rightness that transcended the pain in her legs, the lingering fear from the morning's confrontation, even the uncertainty of what their future together might hold. Kurt kissed her again, sealing their promise to one another, then reluctantly pulled away. "I should let you rest," he said, though he made no move to release her hand. "And I need to speak with Sheriff Davis about arrangements for returning to Austin. When will you leave?" Molly asked, already dreading another separation, however brief. "Tomorrow morning," Kurt replied. "The sooner I go, the sooner I can return, for good this time." As he prepared to leave, Molly called him back for one last question. "Kurt, what will you do once you're settled?" "If not bounty hunting," he considered for a moment. "I've been thinking about that. Val Verde is growing. It could use another lawman, someone with experience tracking criminals. Sheriff Davis isn't getting any younger." The idea of Kurt as a local lawman rather than a roaming bounty hunter was appealing, still utilizing his skills and experience, but in a way that would keep him close to home to her. "I think you'd make an excellent deputy," Molly said with a smile. "And eventually, perhaps, sheriff." Kurt touched the brim of his hat in that gesture she had come to love. "We'll see. For now, I'm content to be the man who loves you, Miss Calloway. The rest will sort itself out in time." With that, he was gone, leaving Molly to rest and to dream of the future they would build together. The week of Kurt's absence passed more quickly than Molly had expected, filled as it was with preparations for their future. Dr. Miller pronounced her recovery back on track, provided she continued to follow his strict instructions for rest. Her editor at the Chronicle was delighted with her account of Cole Harker's demise, though she carefully omitted her own role in the confrontation from the published version. Mrs. Finch, her former landlady, helped her begin assembling a modest trousseau, while Timothy from the hotel took it upon himself to seek out potential houses for rent in Val Verde that might suit a newly married couple. Through it all, Molly found herself reflecting on the extraordinary turn her life had taken since that fateful day in the abandoned mine. 6 weeks ago, she had been a determined but lonely woman, fighting for respect in her profession, and resigned to the probability that marriage and family would pass her by in her pursuit of a career. Now she was engaged to a man who valued both her courage and her intelligence, who saw her career not as an impediment but as an integral part of who she was. Kurt returned on a Sunday afternoon, riding into town with the easy confidence of a man who knows he is coming home. He came directly to the hotel, where Molly was writing at her desk by the window, her injured leg propped on a stool as Dr. Miller had instructed. When Kurt knocked at her door, she knew it was him even before he spoke. "Come in," she called, setting aside her work and smoothing her hair. He entered with his hat in his hands and a smile that warmed her to her core. "Miss Calloway," he greeted her formally, though his eyes danced with private joy. "I trust I find you well." "Much improved, thank you, Mr. Valentin," she replied, matching his tone but unable to suppress her own smile. "I understand congratulations are in order. Sheriff Davis mentioned that the bounty on Cole Harker was substantial." "Substantial enough to start a new life," Kurt confirmed, closing the door behind him and crossing to her side. Without preamble, he bent and kissed her, a proper greeting now that they were alone. "I've missed you," he murmured against her lips. "And I you," Molly replied, drawing him back for another kiss before reluctantly releasing him. "Tell me everything. How was Austin? Did you speak with Sheriff Davis about the deputy position?" Kurt pulled a chair close to hers and sat, taking her hands in his. Austin was busy, growing too fast for its own good. The marshal was pleased to close the Harker case, especially given Cole's reputation. His thumb traced circles on her palm, a gesture that had become familiar and dear to her. "And yes, I spoke with Sheriff Davis this morning. He's offering me the position of chief deputy, with the understanding that he plans to retire within 2 years. "That's wonderful news," Molly said, genuinely pleased. "There's more," Kurt continued, his expression warming. "I found us a house, a small place on Elm Street, but in good repair, with a garden for you and a stable for my horse, and room to grow should we need it." The implications of his last statement brought a flush to Molly's cheeks, but she nodded, her heart full at the thought of the family they might create together. "When can I see it?" "Today, if you're feeling up to a short walk," Kurt offered. "Dr. Miller says your recovery is progressing well and the house is only 3 blocks from here." Molly reached for her walking stick. "Let's go now. I've been cooped up inside for days." Kurt helped her to her feet, his support as natural as breathing. "There's one more thing," he said as they prepared to leave. "I spoke with Reverend Thomas while I was at the sheriff's office. He's available to marry us next Saturday if that suits you." The nearness of the date startled Molly. "So soon?" "I haven't even written to my parents yet, and there's so much to prepare." Kurt's expression grew uncertain. "Too soon? We could wait, of course, if you'd prefer a larger ceremony or time for your family to travel from St. Louis." "No," Molly interrupted, realizing that none of those things mattered to her as much as simply beginning their life together. "Saturday is perfect. My parents will understand. They've been urging me to settle down for years. They'll be so relieved I've finally found someone that they won't mind missing the ceremony." Relief washed over Kurt's features. "I was hoping you'd say that. I've waited long enough to make you my wife, Molly Calloway. I don't want to wait a day longer than necessary." The house on Elm Street was everything Kurt had described: modest but well-maintained, with a small garden full of native plants and a sturdy stable that could house 2 horses comfortably. The interior was simple but charming, with a parlor, kitchen, 2 bedrooms, and a study that would be perfect for Molly's writing. The previous owner was a widow, Kurt explained as he showed her through the rooms. Her son came to take her back east after she fell ill this spring. They were glad to sell quickly. Molly moved from room to room, already envisioning their life here: evenings by the fire in the parlor, mornings in the garden, children playing in the yard. It felt right in a way she couldn't quite articulate, as if the house had been waiting for them. "It's perfect," she said finally, turning to Kurt with shining eyes. "Absolutely perfect." His answering smile was all the confirmation she needed that they were making the right choice, not just about the house, but about their life together. The wedding took place as planned on Saturday, a simple ceremony in the small church that served Val Verde's growing population. Despite the short notice, it seemed the entire town turned out to witness the union of their intrepid reporter and the new deputy sheriff. Dr. Miller gave Molly away, while Sheriff Davis stood as Kurt's best man. Molly wore a dress of pale blue silk that Mrs. Finch had helped her alter from one in her existing wardrobe, with wildflowers in her hair instead of a veil. Kurt wore a new black suit, his silver deputy's badge pinned to his vest. his face clean-shaven and his hair neatly trimmed for the occasion. When Reverend Thomas pronounced them husband and wife, the kiss they shared was both a culmination of the journey that had brought them together and a promise of the path that lay ahead. The cheers of the townspeople as they walked back down the aisle, Molly still using her walking stick, but with Kurt's strong arm for additional support, were a testament to how quickly both had become valued members of the community. The reception was held in the hotel's dining room, decorated with more wildflowers and ribbons by Timothy and the staff, who had taken a proprietary interest in the couple's romance since Molly's time recuperating there. There was food and dancing, though Molly's still healing legs limited her to one cautious waltz with her new husband before she had to retire to a chair to watch others enjoy the festivities. Kurt brought her a plate of food and a glass of punch, sitting beside her with his chair turned to face the same direction, both of them observing the celebration they had inspired. "Happy, Mrs. Valentin?" he asked, the new name falling naturally from his lips. Molly smiled at the sound of it. "Completely, Mr. Valentin." She leaned closer, lowering her voice. "Though I must confess I'm looking forward to the moment when we can politely make our exit." Kurt's answering laugh was low and intimate. "As am I, my love, as am I." Their departure, when it came, was met with good-natured cheers and a shower of rice as they made their way to the waiting buggy that would take them to their new home on Elm Street. As Kurt helped her up into the seat, Molly was struck by how far they had come from that first moment when he had lifted her from beneath the fallen beam in the mine, a journey that had led them not just to safety, but to love and a future neither could have imagined on that fateful day. The house welcomed them with open doors and windows, aired and prepared by Mrs. Finch and other friends while they were at the church. Fresh flowers stood in vases throughout the rooms, and the bed in the master bedroom was turned down invitingly, strewn with rose petals in a romantic touch that made Molly blush when Kurt carried her across the threshold and through the house to their room. "Welcome home, Mrs. Valentin," he said softly as he set her on her feet beside the bed. "Home," Molly repeated, the word holding new meaning now. "I like the sound of that." As Kurt drew her into his arms for a kiss that held all the promise of their wedding night and the life that stretched beyond it, Molly Calloway Valentin knew with absolute certainty that she had found not just safety in this man's arms, but a love that would sustain them through whatever adventures life might bring. Epilogue: 5 years later, the sound of children's laughter echoed through the garden of the house on Elm Street, where Kurt Valentin sat on the porch swing, watching his 3-year-old son, James, chase butterflies among the blooming wildflowers. Beside him, Molly cradled their infant daughter, Elizabeth, who slept peacefully despite her brother's exuberant shouts. "He has your energy," Kurt observed with a smile, his arm draped comfortably around his wife's shoulders. "Never stops moving." "And your stubbornness," Molly countered affectionately. "Once he sets his mind to something like catching that poor butterfly, nothing will dissuade him." The years had been kind to them both. Kurt's hair showed touches of silver at the temples now, and the lines around his eyes had deepened. But they were smile lines mostly, testament to the happiness he had found in family life. As sheriff of Val Verde for the past 3 years, he had brought a steady, fair hand to the growing town's law enforcement, earning the respect of citizens and neighboring communities alike. Molly, too, had flourished. Her landmark series for the Chronicle had eventually become a book, published in San Antonio and moderately successful throughout Texas. She continued to write for the newspaper, covering town council meetings and other local events, but had also begun work on a novel based loosely on their own love story. The injuries from the mine accident had healed completely, Though occasionally her right leg still ached when the weather changed a small price to pay, she often said, for the life she had gained. "Mama, Papa, look," James called, running toward them with cupped hands. "I caught it." Kurt leaned forward as his son approached, admiring the captured butterfly. "Well done, James. That's a monarch. They migrate all the way to Mexico for the winter." "Really?" The boy's eyes widened with wonder. "So far, farther than you can imagine," Molly confirmed. "But we should let this one go now so it can continue its journey. It has a long way to travel." James looked momentarily disappointed but nodded solemnly. "Goodbye, butterfly," he said, opening his hands. The monarch lingered for a moment on his palm, then fluttered away, rising on the warm summer breeze. "Just like your father," Molly murmured, watching her son's face as he tracked the butterfly's flight. "Gentle with creatures smaller than himself." Kurt pressed a kiss to her temple. "I learned that from you," he said softly. "You taught me their strength in gentleness." Molly turned to look at him, her expression warm with love and memories. "Do you ever miss it? The freedom of the trail, the excitement of the hunt?" Kurt considered the question seriously, as he did all of Molly's questions. "Sometimes," he admitted. "In the same way I occasionally miss the discipline of army life or the quiet of a college library. But it's a distant sort of missing, an acknowledgement of a life I once lived, not a desire to return to it." His gaze moved from her face to their sleeping daughter, then to their son who was already chasing another butterfly. "This life we've built together, it's everything I never knew I wanted until I found you. I wouldn't trade a day of it for all the adventure in the world." Molly leaned her head against his shoulder, content in the knowledge that the man who had once carried her from danger to safety had also carried her into a life of love and fulfillment beyond anything she could have imagined on that day in the abandoned mine. "Nor would I," she said softly. "Not a single day." As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, painting the sky in shades of gold and amber that reminded them both of their first evening together so long ago, Kurt and Molly Valentin sat on their porch, surrounded by the family they had created, and the love that had begun with a moment of crisis, but had grown into a lifetime of joy. And in that moment, as in so many moments of their life together, they were complete.